Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and our new wind-down box, a quarterly sleep subscription box full of products I've hand-picked to bring a little more joy and ease to your bedtime. I often feel the need to explain the concept of my stories, of what I do. I probably don't, but here I go again. I write stories that focus on how they make you feel rather than on the arc of a plot. For years, I'd be reading before bed, some great page-turner, but then struggling to find a place to rest my mind. I'd be caught up in the twisty plot or anxious about an unresolved storyline. Add in the general chaos of being a person in the world right now, and it started to become a real problem for me. I started looking for books to read before bed in which nothing much happened. And after coming up empty-handed, I decided to write them myself. That's how my bedtime story podcast started. It's called Nothing Much Happens. You can listen to it tonight. And since then, I've learned that this kind of storytelling can not only help you find a good night's sleep, it can shift you into a better mood. It can relieve anxiety and help you appreciate small pleasures and just rekindle basic enjoyment. Your life is meant to have enjoyment, pleasure, fun. So that's why we're here. Soft, dopamine-heavy stories to listen to while you take a walk or unwind from work or do whatever. Thanks for being here. Oh, and if you stay after the story, I'll give you some behind-the-scenes dish, maybe a little village gossip. Now, before we step into the village, let's take a deep breath in and sigh from your mouth. One more time, inhale and exhale. Good. Our stories today take you through the fruit orchards on the edge of town, to a sunny spot on the back porch, and eventually to dreamland after a good, quiet day. We'll start with stone fruit, where we'll pick the perfect peach. Then we'll check the mail in a letter in an envelope, and spend some time flipping through photos and sheets of stationery. Finally, we'll close the windows as the rain comes down. Make a nest on the sofa, and listen as the dog snores in summer storm. Stone fruit. When I first heard the term stone fruit as a child, I imagined something like a mud pie, something that played at being food for the sake of a tea party held on the lawn or inside a blanket tent in the living room on a rainy day. I think I must have even imagined apples or bananas made of carved stone. And I'd like thinking that even adults needed play food, though it was rather boring of them to make that food fruit. That bit of kid logic persisted until I was in my teens, when I heard the term again on a cooking show. The chef on the screen was making peach preserves and mentioned that most other kinds of stone fruit would work as well. Thinking back, I imagine a question mark appearing above my head in the moment. What? And I'd gone to ask my mother, who laughed, not unkindly, and explained that stone fruit was a fruit with a pit or a stone at its center, like a plum or a cherry Or as on my cooking show, a peach. I guessed stone fruit was a better choice than pit fruit. Over the years, the term had become a part of my own vocabulary. I found I just liked the way it sounded, and the inside joke I had with my younger self about it. And maybe that is what led me to become a lover of nectarines and cherries, apricots and plums, and all the lovely things that can be made from them. There was an orchard outside of town that had rows and rows of fruit trees. I'd drive down the dirt road that edged their land a couple times a week during this part of the summer, slowing down to read the signs propped along their split-rail fence, showing what was ripe and ready. Finally, this week, the signs for peaches and nectarines had come out, and I'd excitedly turned down the long drive to their lot. Apple trees grew along either side of the drive, and in the spring, when the branches were full of white petals, I'd made the same drive more than once. There'd been nothing to pick or buy then, and I hoped that the orchard owners hadn't minded my little car turning around in their parking lot, but I just hadn't been able to help myself. One particular spring day, the wind had been blowing and the petals were raining down like soft snowflakes, and I wanted to be right in the middle of it, to be doused in a flood of them, and I had. Today, apples were growing on those branches, still small, about the size of golf balls and the pale green color of a cabbage leaf. I thought of the autumn, a few months off, but coming with cooler air and apple picking and leaves crunching underfoot. It is a very good thing to enjoy where you are, and at the same time hold a spark of excitement for what is waiting down the road. And right now, waiting down the road were stone fruits. The lot was busy with others who had seen the signs out front, and I found one of the last spots to park my car. As soon as I stepped out, I could smell the rich scent of peaches. The air was full of it. I just breathed it in for a bit, sweet and a little acidic, rich like nectar and somehow juicy. I'd read somewhere about a study that had been conducted to see if people all over the world could agree on whether a scent was pleasant or not, and that there were two that seemed to appeal to humans no matter their culture or geography, and they were vanilla and peach. And that made me think of grilled peaches with vanilla bean ice cream, and my steps quickened across the parking lot. I started in their shop, which was cool and shady after being in the bright sun. They had baskets and baskets of fresh-picked peaches lining the counter. 8 quarts made a peck. 4 pecks made a bushel, all of which were available and looked fresh and unbruised. There were also dark purple plums with shimmering, frosty skin, small orange apricots, and a few early cherries. They made their own jams and preserves, and the jars were lined up in neat rows on their shelves, all the labels facing in the same direction. To pick or not to pick? That was my question. Whether 'tis nobler in the heat of the summer to suffer the slings and arrows of possible sunburn, or to take up a basket of ready fruit, and by buying them, eat them sooner? Oh my. Possibly the peach fumes were making me very silly, and I decided a few minutes of hard work in the fresh air might do me good. I decided to pick my own and took an empty bushel basket from a stack beside the door and headed out toward the trees. I'd learned over the years that picking fruit at the right time was essential. If it didn't get enough time on the tree, the sugars wouldn't develop, the fruit would be sour or just tasteless. If, on the other hand, it stayed too long, the sugars would increase till the tartness was lost, and the freshness that came from the perfect balance of sweet and tart would be replaced with a sort of flat, unappetizing flavor. The best way to know when to pick, especially for someone like me who wasn't a fruit farmer, was just to taste and see. Now, the farmers here knew what they were about, and when they set out the signs at the road, I trusted them. But they also kindly let you eat from any tree you passed to be sure about the bushel you were about to pick. I let my nose guide me as I wandered through the grove with my basket. I came to a tree where the scent was strong and arresting. The fruit's skin was a warm, sunny yellow with a line of blush pink. I reached up for a peach, took it gently, and twisted. It came away easily, another sign that it was ready to eat. I sat down in the shade of the tree and savored every bite of this first peach of the season. I would fill my basket carefully, not stacking them too high lest they squish the ones at the bottom, then cart them home. There would be enough to make a crumble or a cobbler, to have sliced on my pancakes, grilled with my ice cream, and still more to eat just like this, fresh and simple, till all I was left with were the stones. A letter in an envelope. Maybe it was second grade, or maybe third. We'd read a story about pen pals, about a little girl from Portugal and a little boy from Japan. They sent letters back and forth, telling about their families and pets and schools. There'd been an illustration of each of them waiting for the mail to come, eager to hear again from a friend on the other side of the world. It had created a bit of a craze for letter writing in our class, and our teacher had presented us with a list of names and addresses of children in a class in Poland who were keen on being pen pals. I'd drawn the name of a girl named Anna and dutifully set to write her a letter. I don't remember much now about what I wrote her or even what she wrote me, but I do remember the excitement of finding her letter in my mailbox, the green paper of the envelope and the exotic look of her handwriting. I remember her number 4s and how she inked out her J's and F's. While Anna and I lost touch among the shifting responsibilities of 4th grade, I never stopped writing letters and mailing them off to friends. Flowers pressed into their pages, drawings of birds and trees haphazardly sketched across the envelopes. Sometimes just a postcard with a joke written hastily, sometimes many pages needing extra stamps and strips of tape to hold them closed. I had a bundle of letters tied with scraps of ribbon and bits of twine in a long, low box tucked under my bed. And sometimes on a rainy day, I'd dig out a pack to see what we were all talking about 10 years ago. Today, I had a letter to read and a letter to write. A good day. I'd heard the flap and clatter of my mail slot as I'd been spreading peanut butter onto a thick slice of toast for breakfast. I carried the handful of envelopes and mailers back to my kitchen table, and I spotted the corner of an envelope. Pale blue, with a hand-drawn heart, and I felt the same excitement that the boy from Japan and the girl from Portugal had felt. It was a little square envelope, with my name written in tiny, neat script, and stickers of flowers sealing it shut. I propped it open against my glass of grapefruit juice and sat down to finish my toast. I liked waiting to open a letter for a bit, letting the anticipation build. Plus, I didn't want to get peanut butter on that pretty blue paper, and I was fairly sure that I would. I took my time, working my way through my toast and juice and a lovely ripe banana. I tidied up my plates and washed my hands and carried my letter to a sunny spot on the back porch where I could look out at the growing garden as I read. The letter was from a friend since childhood. We'd grown up on the same street, but now lived far apart. Many people who rarely see each other write long letters to catch up. Updates on work and love and family, and certainly that is all useful and welcome information, but my friend and I didn't send those kinds of letters to each other. We sent little collections of interesting things, whatever seemed curious to us at the time of sending. Inside the envelope, I found a list of books she'd read in the past month, with a series of hand-drawn stars beside each one to show what she'd thought. There was a recipe on an index card for a curry dish her neighbor made, a ticket stub from a play she'd seen with a line that had stuck in her head on the back, a note from her little boy about summer camp, and a stick of gum, the kind I loved to chew in high school. I opened the foil and chewed it right there on the porch as I looked back through the stash of finds. I'd read a couple of the same books and thought about how I'd have ranked them. I realized I had all the ingredients for the curry dish and figured that was dinner sorted out. I remembered some stories from our own days at summer camp and thought I might write some out for my reply. I stepped back inside and flipped through my stationery box. I had papers in lots of sizes and shades, postcards bought on faraway travels or just from the corner store, but also a stack of old photos. I'd been collecting them for ages. Some from old albums in the attic, and some found here and there in garage sales and flea markets. I sometimes held an old photo, a very old one, and wondered if it was the last image left of the person pictured. They'd had a whole life somewhere, loves and losses, favorite songs and sworn enemies, and it felt like taking a moment to look at them gave them a breath of life again. I shuffled through them and pulled out a Polaroid from the 60s of a little boy sitting on a sofa with his grandma, and another, older, from the 30s, of two girls in dresses standing in front of a clapboard front porch. On the strip of space under the Polaroid, I wrote, "Stuff a date with almond butter," or mint leaves, but not both. On the back of the pictures of the girls, I wrote, "Ask your mom about the camp talent show. Does she still tap dance?" I smiled at the memory and wondered if it would make the little boy laugh. I added in a scrap I'd cut from the police blotter of the local paper about a woman who'd been stealing flowers from her neighbor's yard, underlying the words, "Suspect has not been apprehended." Lastly, I jotted down a few lines about a lecture I went to at the library the week before about grafting apple trees. The scion, I explained, was the bit being grafted. The rootstock, I told her, was its new home. I bundled it all into an envelope and sealed it with red wax, pressing a star-shaped stamp into it. A letter received and a letter written. Wondering if my friend would remember the story from our year in 3rd grade, I wrote across the envelope, "From Japan to Portugal." Summer storm. The rain didn't start until the evening, but the whole day had been dim and overcast. And while sunshine lifted my spirits, there was something soothing about a cloudy day. It felt like a suggestion from nature to be quiet and do less. It felt like the moment when you realize you've been hunching your shoulders and you suddenly release them and feel the space around your heart open up. The windows were open all over the house. I'd been keeping them closed against the heat most days this summer, opening them up only late at night and early in the morning when the temperature outside finally dropped lower than inside, but the cloudy day had been cooler from the start. I'd lit candles against the gloom and put fresh sheets on my bed and played a favorite album on repeat for most of the day. When the notes fell into my rather limited range, I'd lean into them, belting out, knowing every word. It reminded me of being 20, in my first car, singing at the top of my lungs along winding country roads. I still felt as carefree and ready for adventure as my 20-year-old self, even in my socks and with a mug of chamomile held under my chin. They don't tell you this about growing up. You don't lose your younger selves as you age. They aren't left behind. They just get added into the older versions, like cards shuffled together into a progressively fuller deck. A more true understanding of yourself and the world. I had a friend who called this Earth School, and I liked thinking of it that way. What I learned, what lessons I had to go back and take over again, and the realization that there was no graduating, just moving on to other subjects and skills and interests. In the afternoon, the clouds got thicker and the shadows in the house were deep. I'd had a burst of energy in the morning and made a batch of oatmeal raisin cookies, a long simmering pot of black bean soup, and a crusty cottage loaf. I'd been nibbling at all three here and there whenever my stomach grumbled. And once the mixing bowls and cookie sheets were washed and put away, I felt ready to spend the remainder of the day doing very little and resting a lot. Rest is one of those too little used but very effective forms of gentle medicine. I'd learned a long time ago to think of rest as I might think of drinking water. If I was thirsty, I didn't hesitate to take a drink. I didn't try to get through the day first or get by on as little as possible, and I certainly didn't feel guilty about taking as much as I needed. When I started to think of rest in the same way, it got easier for me to feel for when I needed it, and to give it to myself without hesitation. So I made a nest on the sofa, a big fluffy blanket, soft pillows, my book, my tea, and my dog, who, bless her, in her senior years, had managed to sleep through all my singing. She was an old gray-faced beagle whose long floppy ears were as soft as velvet. And though she didn't follow me around the house anymore, she did wait till I sat down somewhere and then scooted up into the spot beside me. I'd finally turned off my music and just listened to the steady sound of her breathing. She had fawn speckles across her white and brown back, and a stripe across the ankles of her back feet. I unclipped her collar and massaged her neck as we snuggled on the couch. She let out sleepy old dog grunts when I thought back to our early days when we'd run down the sidewalks together, her nose to the concrete, sniffing out the trails of every person and animal who'd passed by the whole week before. She didn't feel much like running these days, but her nose was still sharp, and most mornings I could get her to play a favorite game. While she was out in the backyard attending to her doggy business, I'd take one of her favorite cookies and walk it through the house, setting it here and there, and finally leaving it somewhere she could reach. When I let her back in, I'd pat her back and tell her to find the cookie. She'd start sniffing and snuffling along the floors, and her nose would go everywhere the biscuit had, from one room to the other, until she found it and snatched it up from the seat of a chair in the dining room, or the edge of a stair in the landing, or the inside of my shoe at the door. She was doing her own bit of Earth School. We lay together as the afternoon turned to evening. I took turns between reading my book and letting it fall onto my chest as I dipped into sleep. At some point, I got up to warm the soup, and as I stood by the kitchen windows, tiny raindrops struck the pane, like droplets of paint flung from the end of a brush. The rain that we'd been expecting all day was finally falling. I nudged the window shut where it was coming in and spooned up a bowl of soup. I cut a slice of bread and carried it all back to our nest. I settled back into my spot, and my dog hitched herself up a bit and laid her front paws over my leg. I didn't know how much she could hear or see. Maybe she was smelling it, but she lifted her head and seemed to watch the rain come down, It went from mist to full, round, heavy raindrops, and I thought of how green the grass would be within a week from tonight's dousing. The sound of the falling rain rang through the house, steady and drumming on the roof, racing along the eaves and cascading through the downspouts. My water barrel would be full again in the morning. I broke bits of bread off, and she chewed them slowly as we watched the rain outside. "Dinner and a show," I said to her. It had rained all night, and when we finally moved from the couch to the bed, we slept like rocks till the morning light broke through our curtains. I was vaguely aware that there had been lightning and thunder crashing in the distance sometime in the middle of the night. I think I'd sat up in bed to make sure she wasn't startled by the noise, but she lay at my feet snoring soundly. When I opened the back door and we stepped outside, me still happily in my pajamas, a bright blue cloudless sky stretched above us, and the very best smell was coming up from the ground. That deep, after the storm rain smell. It filled me back up with energy. And after our day of rest, I thought we might just try a walk this morning. We had another day of Earth School. Now, before I send you off home, I thought I'd share a few thoughts and behind-the-scene tidbits about these stories. All of these stories, by the way, are meant to take place in the same universe, in our village of nothing much. Stone Fruit takes place at the village orchards, which figures into lots of autumn stories, and it's also frequently cited as being right on the edge of town. Being from Michigan, there has not been an October in my life in which I have not visited an orchard. Although if I'm honest, I have never gone picking. Not for apples, not for strawberries, not for peaches. But I have written stories about it several times. As I write these stories, I love that I have an excuse to look things up. Like the bit about the universally enjoyable scents. I've learned a lot over the years about what plants grow where and when, identifying birds, constellations, types of clouds. I honestly have the best job in the world. The second story, A Letter in an Envelope, is the oldest of these three, originally appearing in Season 4, and we are currently in Season 14 for reference. Did you catch the bit about the woman mentioned in the police blotter who'd been stealing flowers? Do you think this could be the lilac thief? I don't know. I don't think she would ever steal from someone's actual yard. It could be a frame job. Finally, Summer Storm was a story that sat in my drafts for a while. In fact, it was called Spring Storm at first and needed an edit by the time I was ready to release it. After being a full-time yoga teacher for 20 years, there are a lot of lessons I learned that I'd like to pass along. Like first this, then that. And this idea of thinking of rest as you would drinking water. I remember a student coming to me talking about how tired she was, not just physically, but in all ways worn out from her life, and how she struggled to let herself rest. And it struck me how her exhaustion was now being compounded by guilt, and how we are frequently taught to feel guilty for taking the things that we simply need. It made me think that luckily we don't feel guilty for breathing, for drinking water. And I started to draw a line between those basic physiological needs in class. And so many students told me that the comparison was helpful. So please let me remind you, you are allowed to take up space and to need things. And I think this goes deeper than just feeling guilty for resting. I think some of us have internalized the idea that we are our best selves and most lovable when we need nothing and cause no interruptions and ask for nothing. But what that actually does is create falseness in our relationships. It's unsustainable. It's an abandonment of self, and it leaves a mark. It took me years to believe that I could need things, I could have bad days, I could inconvenience someone, and still be loved. But I am here to report it is actually one of the ways we connect most strongly to others, by needing and asking and allowing ourselves to receive. If any of this feels applicable to you, maybe start just by thinking of your basic needs as you think of drinking water. Practice resting without guilt. Practice eating when you are hungry without second-guessing it. Oof, this is a whole can of worms, isn't it? But listen, it's all connected to letting yourself be human, finding out what your impulses and instincts are underneath the internalized judgments. And you can tip the first domino just by resting. Something solved by sleeping? Well, you know that is my cup of tea. Thank you for spending some time here with me in the village. It wouldn't be the same without you. We'll be back soon with more soft stories to settle you, to soothe you, and hopefully to entertain you.